Mephibosheth was born during a time of splendor and promise, an era when the kingdom of Israel was under the leadership of King Saul, his grandfather. He was the son of Jonathan, Saul's firstborn, a young man known for his courage, integrity, and an unbreakable friendship with David, the future king. From the moment of his birth, Mephibosheth was surrounded by the brilliance of royalty, his life marked by the expectations placed upon the heirs to the throne. Jonathan, a fearless warrior, was not only a prince, but also a man of great character. His friendship with David was something rare and precious, a bond that transcended the politics of the kingdom and familial rivalries. Jonathan saw in David a kindred spirit, someone who shared his faith in God and his desire to serve Israel. He knew that David was destined for great things, and in a sacred pact, he promised to protect and honor each other's lineage. Mephibosheth grew up in the palace halls, listening to stories of bravery and faith, absorbing the teachings of his father. He saw in Jonathan a model of leadership that balanced strength with compassion, and even at a young age, he felt the responsibility to continue that legacy. But there was something darker growing in the shadows of the palace, a palpable tension that seeped into the celebrations and royal council meetings. King Saul, an imposing figure who had once been chosen by God to lead Israel, was now enveloped in a cloud of fear and envy. He saw David, the young shepherd who had defeated the giant Goliath, as a threat to his throne. This paranoia drove Saul to a relentless pursuit, where David was forced to flee for his life, despite Jonathan's loyalty. As this tragedy unfolded, Mephibosheth was just a child, shielded from the gravity of the conflicts by those who loved him. He played in the palace gardens, unaware that his family's destiny was shifting and that the promise of a bright future was about to be shattered. Yet, even amidst the growing darkness, the alliance between Jonathan and David remained strong. This alliance, based on love and faith, would be the anchor that, years later, would save Mephibosheth from a fate of complete obscurity. Jonathan, aware of what the future might hold, remembered his promise to David and paved the way for his lineage to be protected, even after his death. In the palace corridors, where the brilliance of royalty contrasted with the shadows of doubt, Mephibosheth lived his early years. Unbeknownst to him, he was part of a much larger story, one that would weave a path of redemption, grace, and mercy through the decisions and sacrifices of those who came before him. And so, in the heart of Israel, a child grew up destined to learn the deepest lessons of love and justice, not through achievements and glories, but through divine grace manifested in unexpected ways. The sun was high in the sky, but the atmosphere in the palace was thick with tension. News of the defeat in the hills of Gilboa spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of fear and despair. King Saul and his son Jonathan, both leaders and heroes of Israel, had fallen in battle. The defeat was not just military. It was the end of an era, the collapse of a dynasty. Amidst this calamity, Mephibosheth, still a young boy, found himself engulfed in a panic he could not fully understand. His nurse, sensing the danger approaching, acted quickly. She knew that with Saul's fall, Israel's enemies might come after the last male descendant of the royal line. She took Mephibosheth in her arms and ran, desperate to save the boy's life. In her haste and desperation, an accident occurred. She stumbled, and young Mephibosheth fell from her arms. The fall was severe, and the impact left the boy gravely injured. His legs, which had once been strong and agile, were now irreparably damaged. The life he had known, of running in the palace gardens and playing under his father's watchful eye, had changed forever. As chaos reigned in Israel, Mephibosheth was taken to Lodabar, a distant and desolate land, far from the brilliance and splendor of the palace he once called home. Lodabar was a place of exile, a forgotten corner of the world where the marginalized and the desperate were sent. For Mephibosheth, the boy who once had the world at his feet, This was an almost unimaginable fate. From that day on, Mephibosheth lived a new reality. He was the heir to a lineage in ruins, and his physical condition was a constant reminder of what had been lost. The brilliance of royalty, the stories of bravery, the security of a life in the palace. All of this now belonged to a distant past. The present was filled with limitations and a life of dependency. Yet, despite the adversities, there was a spark of hope in Mephibosheth. He carried the name of his father, Jonathan, a man known for his kindness and courage. Even without the comfort of his father's presence, Mephibosheth clung to the memories of Jonathan's love, which made him believe that his life, even in Lodabar, still had purpose. The boy who once ran freely now moved with difficulty, but he was not broken in spirit. The scars he bore, both physical and emotional, would shape who he would become, but they would not define him. In a world that seemed to have forgotten him, Mephibosheth held on to a silent faith that somehow the darkness in which he lived would one day give way to light. As Lodabar continued to be both his refuge and prison, Mephibosheth learned to live a life of resilience. He did not know what the future held, but the seed of hope planted by his father still grew within him, preparing him for a destiny he could never have foreseen. Lodabar, a place forgotten by many, became Mephibosheth's home. Situated in a barren and isolated region, this distant land stood in stark contrast to the golden halls of the palace where he had spent his childhood. The dry mountains and valleys mirrored the emptiness Mephibosheth felt in his heart. Here, he was no longer seen as a prince, but as someone who bore the weight of his family's downfall and his own broken body. The house where Mephibosheth lived belonged to Machir, a generous man who had offered shelter to the crippled heir of the kingdom. Machir did not see Mephibosheth as a burden, but as someone deserving of compassion and respect. He not only provided him with a roof over his head, but also dignity in a place where life was harsh and opportunities were scarce. Mephibosheth's days in Lodabar were monotonous and lonely. The physical limitations imposed by his injury made him dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. Each painful movement reminded him of the accident that had changed his life forever. However, the young man's mind often wandered back to the past, to memories of a time when he was surrounded by love and hope. He wondered what his life would be like if he had not fallen, if his father and grandfather were still alive. But Lodabar was not just a place of pain, it was also a place of reflection. Mephibosheth, without the distractions of luxury and power, began to see life differently. He learned to appreciate the small things, the kindness of Machir, the company of the few friends he made, and even the rugged beauty of the landscape around him. He realized that although his body was broken, his mind and spirit were still strong. Despite this, there were moments when darkness enveloped him. The loss of his royal inheritance, the absence of his father, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on him. In the quiet nights, he wondered if his life had any meaning beyond being a living reminder of what his family had lost. Bitterness threatened to consume his soul, but there was always a small spark of hope that he couldn't extinguish. Mephibosheth found solace in faith, recalling the stories his father, Jonathan, had told him about courage and trust. He believed that somehow his life still had a purpose, even if he couldn't see it at the time. Each day in Lodabar was a lesson in patience and resilience, and Mephibosheth began to understand that his journey was not defined solely by his circumstances, but also by how he chose to live within them. As the years passed, Mephibosheth grew accustomed to life in Lodabar, but he never stopped dreaming of something greater. He didn't know that his fate was about to change once again, in a way he could never have imagined. Life in Lodabar was hard, but it was also shaping Mephibosheth for what was to come, preparing his heart for a grace he had yet to discover. In the palace of Jerusalem, David, now the king of Israel, walked through the corridors, his thoughts turning to days long past when he was an unknown shepherd, without position, and his best friend, Jonathan, was the heir to Saul's throne. The friendship between the two had been forged in the fires of battle and tempered by mutual loyalty. They were brothers in spirit, bound by a bond that transcended blood, politics, and even family loyalties. Jonathan knew that David was destined to be king, chosen by God to lead Israel. He accepted this destiny with grace, even knowing it meant the end of Saul's lineage. In an act of sacrificial love, Jonathan made a covenant with David, swearing eternal loyalty and asking that David show kindness to his descendants, even after he was gone. They sealed this covenant with tears and promises, aware that their lives were in God's hands. Years passed, and as Jonathan had foreseen, David ascended to the throne after the deaths of Saul and his beloved friend. The memory of Jonathan, however, never left David. Amid the victories and challenges of his reign, he often recalled Jonathan's words, the promises they had made to each other. The weight of this covenant was both a comfort and a constant reminder that no matter how much power and glory surrounded him, his loyalty to Jonathan and his lineage remained. One morning, as David contemplated the horizon, a question arose in his heart. Was there any descendant of Jonathan still alive? Someone to whom he could show the kindness and loyalty he had promised? Moved by this desire to honor his friend's memory, David summoned Ziba, a former servant of Saul's house. Ziba was a trusted man who had served King Saul faithfully and knew the family's history well. When Ziba came into David's presence, the king asked sincerely, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Ziba, without hesitation, replied, "There is still a son of Jonathan, crippled in both feet. He lives in Lodabar." Ziba's words brought to David's mind images of Jonathan and the sacrifice his friend had made. David knew he could not pass up this opportunity to fulfill his promise. He ordered that Mephibosheth be brought to the palace, not knowing exactly what the meeting would bring, but with a heart full of determination to honor the covenant made so many years before. At that moment, David was not just fulfilling a royal duty. He was acting out of love and gratitude, remembering that his reign was not just about power, but also about keeping promises and extending mercy. As he awaited the meeting with Jonathan's son, David felt that he was about to do something that would give his reign an even deeper meaning. The quiet of the morning in the palace was interrupted by the arrival of Ziba, the former servant of Saul's house. David, with his heart full of memories of his friend Jonathan, prepared for the meeting. He knew that Ziba brought important news, something that could rekindle the memory of a friendship that had marked his life forever. Ziba entered the throne room with respect, bowing before the king. He was a man well acquainted with the corridors of power, having served King Saul in days gone by. David, always direct, wasted no time on trivial questions. His mind was focused on a greater purpose, discovering if there was anyone left of Jonathan's house to whom he could show kindness and fulfill the covenant he had made years before. Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness for Jonathan's sake? David asked, his voice laden with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Ziba looked at the king and, after a brief pause, replied, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet. He lives in Lodabar." Ziba's words echoed through the room, bringing with them a bittersweet reminder of the past. David's heart tightened at the news of his dear friend's son. Mephibosheth, the boy he remembered as a joyful child in Jonathan's arms, now lived in a desolate place, far from the palace and the glory that once belonged to his family. David knew immediately that he needed to bring Mephibosheth close, not out of obligation, but out of love and loyalty. David firmly ordered that Mephibosheth be brought to the palace. He wanted to see with his own eyes what had become of Jonathan's son, and more than that, he desired to fulfill the promise he had made to his best friend. The decision was made swiftly, but David felt the weight of the responsibility he bore. As David's servants departed for Lodabar, David was left alone with his thoughts. He remembered how Jonathan had always believed in him, even when no one else did. Jonathan had risked his own life to protect David, placing their friendship above political and familial interests. Now, David felt he had the chance to repay that loyalty in a way that would honor Jonathan's memory and bring comfort to Mephibosheth's heart. The days passed slowly as David awaited the return of his servants. He wondered what the reunion with Mephibosheth would be like, what he would say to his friend's son, and how the young man would react to being summoned to the royal court. But more than anything, David knew that he was about to do something that would transcend politics and power. He was about to offer grace, love, and redemption to someone who believed they had been forgotten. Finally, the servants returned with Mephibosheth, and David prepared for the meeting that would change both their lives forever. Destiny was about to reunite the paths of David and Jonathan's lineage, this time in a way that only true love and loyalty could accomplish. The day arrived, and the great throne room was silent as David awaited Mephibosheth's arrival. He knew that this meeting would not be easy, not for the young man who had been torn from a life of promise and cast into the obscurity of Lodabar. But David was determined to fulfill his promise to Jonathan, showing his friend's son the kindness he deserved, despite the circumstances. Mephibosheth entered the room, carried by servants, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. He could hardly believe he was standing before the great King David, the man who ruled Israel with justice and strength. The journey from Lodabar to the palace had been one of anxiety for him, as he did not know what awaited him. His heart was heavy with the fear that his life might be hanging by a thread, that perhaps David, as the new king, might want to eliminate all possible heirs of the old dynasty. When Mephibosheth was finally placed before the throne, he prostrated himself, his crippled legs folded beneath him. With a trembling voice, he murmured, "Here is your servant." There was a heavy silence in the room as David looked at Jonathan's son. David saw not just the crippled heir of Saul, but the boy Jonathan had loved so dearly, the boy who had been born to inherit a throne and who now found himself at the feet of the new king, broken in body and spirit. David leaned forward, his voice soft and full of compassion. "Mephibosheth," he said, calling him by name, "do not be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." David's words fell like balm on Mephibosheth. He could not believe what he was hearing. He had expected a death sentence, but he received grace. He had expected rejection, but he was welcomed. His trembling hands gripped the floor as he bowed even lower, unable to contain the emotion flooding over him. "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" he whispered, his voice full of humility and gratitude. But David did not see a dead dog in Mephibosheth. He saw the legacy of Jonathan. He saw the covenant he had made with his best friend, and he saw a young man in need of redemption and a place to belong. He ordered Ziba, Saul's servant, to care for Mephibosheth's land and to serve him faithfully. Mephibosheth, in turn, would be treated as a son of the king, dining daily at David's table. From that day on, Mephibosheth's life changed forever. The young man who had lived in exile, forgotten and forsaken, now had a place of honor in the heart of the kingdom. And more than that, he had a place at the king's table, a position of dignity and respect. By extending this kindness to Mephibosheth, David not only honored his promise to Jonathan, but also showed that true power lies not in destroying, but in restoring, in bringing life where there was once death. Mephibosheth's life was irrevocably changed after his encounter with King David. The young man, who had once lived in the obscurity of Lodabar, was transported to the center of royal life, a place he never expected to be again. David, true to his word, not only restored to him the lands of his grandfather Saul, but also brought him into the palace, where Mephibosheth now had a guaranteed place at the king's table. For Mephibosheth, the transition was startling. He was no longer just a forgotten cripple, living at the mercy of others' kindness. Now, he was treated as one of the king's sons, with all the privileges and honors that position brought. Each day was a reminder of the unexpected kindness he had received, a grace he could never have imagined while living in Lodabar. However, adapting to this new life was not simple. Mephibosheth found himself surrounded by wealth and comfort, but there was an internal struggle within his heart. He had difficulty accepting that he was worthy of so much. The scars of his past, both physical and emotional, still weighed on him, and at times he wondered if it was all a dream, something that could be taken away from him at any moment. Despite his fears, David made a point of treating Mephibosheth with kindness and respect. He saw him as a constant reminder of Jonathan, his dear friend, and wanted to honor that memory in every way possible. David understood what it was like to carry the weight of a difficult past, and his own experience of being hunted by Saul made him more sensitive to Mephibosheth's pain and insecurity. Ziba, the servant who had served Saul's house, was tasked with managing Mephibosheth's lands and ensuring that everything was done for his well-being. With his many sons and servants, Ziba worked diligently to restore Mephibosheth's estate, bringing back the prosperity that had once characterized Saul's household. Life at the king's table was an experience Mephibosheth could never have anticipated. He sat alongside David's sons, sharing in royal meals, listening to conversations about the kingdom, battles, and matters of state. Despite his physical condition, he was treated as an equal, and the kindness he received from the king's sons helped him feel like part of this new family. Mephibosheth, though full of gratitude, carried in his heart a deep sense of humility. He knew that none of this was due to his own merit, but rather to David's kindness and faithfulness to the covenant with Jonathan. Each day, he remembered where he had come from, and this kept him grounded, aware that his life was a testament to the grace he had received. As time passed, Mephibosheth began to flourish in the new life he had been given. The wounds of the past did not disappear, but they began to heal as he experienced the love and acceptance he never imagined possible. And so, the young man who had once been relegated to oblivion found a new purpose and a new identity, not as the crippled grandson of Saul, but as a son at the king's table, wrapped in grace and redemption. Mephibosheth's days in David's court became marked by a routine that, although new to him, soon became familiar. Each morning, he would rise in his luxurious quarters, a stark contrast to the simple room he once occupied in Lodabar. The servants would help him prepare for the day, always with kindness and respect, as if he were indeed a prince of royal blood. This constant kindness was, for Mephibosheth, a daily proof of the goodness he now experienced. The highlight of his days was the meal at the king's table. Sitting with David's sons, sharing the same delicacies, was something Mephibosheth still found hard to believe. He observed David's other sons, Absalom, Adonijah, Solomon, each with their own personality, their own place in the kingdom. Mephibosheth, though still feeling somewhat out of place, began to realize that he too had a place there, a place that David made sure to secure for him. In his interactions with Mephibosheth, David always made a point to include the young man in the court's conversations and activities. The king never treated him with pity, but with the respect reserved for someone of noble lineage. Mephibosheth, in turn, began to gain confidence. He realized that despite his physical limitations, his mind was sharp and his counsel was valued. Living with David and his sons allowed Mephibosheth to grow in knowledge and wisdom, and his presence at court became more than just a formality. He began to truly feel part of that family. Mephibosheth's new life also brought new challenges. Adapting to life at court was not just about getting used to luxury, but also about navigating the complex dynamics of power and relationships. He observed the rivalries among David's sons and understood that royal life was not free from conflict. Mephibosheth, however, chose to remain apart from these disputes, preferring to be a silent observer and a careful listener. The respect Mephibosheth earned at court did not go unnoticed. His story of redemption, of someone who had gone from obscurity to honor, touched the hearts of those who knew his past. He began to be seen not just as Saul's grandson, but as a man who carried the dignity and courage of his lineage. People at court, including servants and soldiers, came to admire Mephibosheth for his humility and gratitude. As the years passed, Mephibosheth found his place in the court. He grew closer to David, who saw in him a reflection of Jonathan, his dear friend. David often sought Mephibosheth out for private conversations, where they would share stories of the past and dreams for the future. These conversations were precious to both of them, as they strengthened the bond that united them, a bond forged in loyalty, friendship, and mutual respect. Mephibosheth's new life in David's court was undoubtedly one of unexpected blessings. He, who had once been forgotten and marginalized, was now valued and loved. The shadows of Lodabar still lingered in his memory, but the light of the present was strong enough to dispel them. Mephibosheth was living a life he had never imagined possible, and each day spent at the king's table was a testament to the transformation he had undergone, a life that, despite the scars of the past, was now full of purpose and hope. Despite the new life Mephibosheth was building in David's court, not everyone was pleased with his rise. Ziba, the former servant of Saul, who had been tasked with managing Mephibosheth's lands, began to harbor resentments in his heart. Before Mephibosheth's arrival at the palace, Ziba had controlled Saul's family's lands and properties with relative freedom. Now, with the restoration of the lands to Mephibosheth, Ziba saw his own power and influence waning. Ziba was a shrewd man, and although he continued to serve Mephibosheth outwardly, in his heart, he began to scheme how he could regain the influence he felt he was losing. He watched Mephibosheth with critical eyes, looking for flaws or weaknesses he could exploit to undermine his position. Ziba believed that if he could plant doubts about Mephibosheth's loyalty or capability, he might be able to reclaim control of the properties. Mephibosheth, on the other hand, trusted Ziba and was unaware of the growing animosity. He saw Ziba as a loyal servant who had served his family for many years. Mephibosheth had no reason to doubt Ziba's intentions, especially since David had entrusted him with the management of his lands. This blind trust made Mephibosheth vulnerable, not realizing that a growing threat was right under his nose. Ziba began to manipulate situations, sowing small seeds of distrust in the court. He insinuated that Mephibosheth might be plotting against David, using his condition as a facade to hide his true intentions. Although these insinuations were subtle, they were enough to cast a shadow of doubt among those who did not know Mephibosheth well. At the same time, Ziba began undermining Mephibosheth's authority on his own lands, making decisions that benefited himself and his sons while claiming to act in Mephibosheth's best interest. He maintained a facade of loyalty, but his actions revealed his true character, a man who sought power and control above all else. David's court, a place where power and influence were constantly contested, was fertile ground for Ziba's machinations. Intrigues and internal disputes were common, and Ziba knew how to navigate this environment. He aligned himself with those who stood to gain the most from Mephibosheth's downfall, spreading his lies carefully. Mephibosheth, however, remained oblivious to Ziba's conspiracies. His humble nature and desire to live peacefully in the court blinded him to the reality of the threats surrounding him. He continued to live his life with gratitude, unaware that Ziba was working behind the scenes to undermine him. But David, who was well acquainted with the games of power, began to sense that something was amiss. The stories reaching him about Mephibosheth didn't match the man he knew and loved as a son. David began to suspect that someone was trying to manipulate the situation, and he decided to watch more closely, determined to uncover the truth and protect Mephibosheth as he had promised Jonathan. Thus, while Ziba plotted his intrigues, David remained vigilant. waiting for the right moment to act and ensure that justice prevailed. Mephibosheth, unknowingly, was about to face the greatest test of his new life at court, a test that would reveal the true character of those around him and solidify his position as a man of honor. The kingdom of David, which had enjoyed years of prosperity and peace, began to feel the tremors of an impending rebellion. Absalom, David's charismatic and ambitious son, began conspiring to take his father's throne. Absalom's beauty, combined with his charm and skill in manipulating public opinion, made him a powerful figure, capable of attracting loyal followers among the kingdom's dissatisfied. Determined to usurp the throne, Absalom began gathering forces in secret. He positioned himself at the city gates, listening to the people's complaints and promising justice where, according to him, his father had failed. Over time, his base of support grew, and he believed he was ready to challenge David and claim the throne of Israel. When news of the revolt reached the palace, David was forced to act quickly. Knowing that the situation was critical and that the city of Jerusalem was about to become a battlefield, David made the difficult decision to flee, taking with him those who remained loyal. Among those left behind in Jerusalem was Mephibosheth, who, due to his physical condition, could not accompany David in the flight. Ziba, seizing the opportunity presented by Absalom's rebellion, decided to act in his own selfish interests. Upon learning of David's departure, Ziba went to meet the king with a gift of provisions and horses, apparently to help the king in his escape. When David saw him, he inquired about Mephibosheth, concerned for Jonathan's son's well-being. Ziba, however, lied outright, saying that Mephibosheth had stayed in Jerusalem, hoping that with David's fall and Absalom's rise, Saul's throne would be restored and that he, Mephibosheth, would be crowned king. Ziba's words struck David like a dagger to the heart. He had trusted Mephibosheth, treated him like a son, and now it seemed that trust had been betrayed. Without further investigation, and in the chaos of the flight, David made a hasty decision. He gave Ziba all of Mephibosheth's lands and properties, believing that the young man had chosen betrayal. As David fled, bitter and feeling betrayed, Mephibosheth remained in Jerusalem, unaware of Ziba's treachery and the fate that now awaited him. He was unable to follow David, but in his heart, there was no room for ambition or betrayal, only loyalty to the king who had shown him such kindness. As Absalom advanced with his forces, the situation in Israel grew increasingly tense. David, ever the strategist, planned his counteroffensive, but the weight of the supposed betrayals by his close allies, especially Mephibosheth, weighed heavily on his heart. Absalom's revolt was about to culminate in a battle that would decide Israel's fate, and the role of each character in this drama would become crucial. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and Ziba's lies had planted seeds of distrust and pain. Mephibosheth, unknowingly, was at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had been given. But as the winds of war blew, the truth remained hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Absalom's revolt ended in tragedy. The decisive battle took place in the forests of Ephraim, where David's loyal forces prevailed. Absalom, in his attempt to flee, was caught by his long hair in an oak tree, and despite David's orders that his life be spared, he was killed by Joab, the commander of David's army. The news of Absalom's death devastated David, who mourned deeply for the loss of his son, even knowing that Absalom had conspired against him. With the rebellion quashed, David returned to Jerusalem to reclaim the throne. The return was bittersweet. The military victory was overshadowed by personal pain and the perceived betrayal of those he had trusted. One of these supposed traitors, David believed, was Mephibosheth. The sorrow in David's heart was palpable as he finally reached the palace and began to gather those who had remained in Jerusalem during the revolt. Mephibosheth, aware of the king's return, immediately presented himself before David. He was in a deplorable state. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and his feet uncared for since the day David had fled Jerusalem. Upon seeing him, David was surprised by his appearance and asked why he had not left with him during the flight. Mephibosheth, with humility and sincerity, explained to David what had really happened. He recounted how Ziba had deceived him, leaving him behind while he himself went to find the king. Mephibosheth, unable to move quickly due to his condition, had been betrayed and abandoned. He expressed his loyalty to David, stating that he had never desired the throne and was ready to accept any judgment David wished to impose, but that his loyalty to the king had never wavered. Mephibosheth's words touched David's heart. He saw the truth in Mephibosheth's eyes and realized the mistake he had made in trusting Ziba's words. David always just knew he needed to correct the situation. However, he was also aware that Ziba had proven useful during the flight, providing valuable resources at a time of need. In a gesture of fairness, David decided to divide the lands between Mephibosheth and Ziba, allowing both to retain part of the inheritance. Mephibosheth, however, showed his true nobility of spirit by responding that Ziba could have everything, for he was content simply to see David return safely to the throne. For Mephibosheth, the lands and wealth were insignificant compared to the loyalty and love he felt for David. David, moved by Mephibosheth's humility and devotion, reaffirmed his position in the court, ensuring that he would continue to eat at his table and be treated as a son. The reconciliation between David and Mephibosheth was complete, and the truth, finally revealed, restored the trust between them. Ziba, on the other hand, was reminded that David's justice could not be manipulated without consequences. Although he retained part of the lands, his position in the court was never the same, and he lived with the weight of his actions. Mephibosheth, meanwhile, moved forward with the peace of knowing that his loyalty and integrity had prevailed. Thus, the cycle of betrayal and redemption came to a close. Mephibosheth, once forgotten in Lodabar, was now firmly established in David's court, his life marked not by ambition or vengeance, but by a heart full of gratitude and fidelity. And David, a king seasoned in both victories and losses, continued to reign, aware that true power lies not only in ruling, but in discerning the truth and exercising mercy. Time passed, and Mephibosheth's story became one of the most touching and inspiring narratives in David's kingdom. The young man who had started his life as a potential prince, who then faced the tragedy of being crippled and relegated to obscurity in Lodabar, was now known throughout Israel as a symbol of loyalty, humility, and grace. In David's court, Mephibosheth continued to live with dignity, always aware of his position as one of the king's sons. He stood out not for political or military ambitions, but for his wisdom and discernment, acquired through years of suffering and redemption. Mephibosheth became a respected counselor, someone others turned to for moral and ethical guidance. The story of his transformation, from someone forgotten by all but God and David, touched the hearts of everyone who heard it. Mephibosheth was not ashamed of his physical disability. On the contrary, he used it as a constant reminder that even in the most difficult conditions, there is always hope for redemption and a new beginning. His life became a living testimony of the kindness he had received and the importance of maintaining integrity, regardless of circumstances. David, in turn, continued to value Mephibosheth not only as the son of his dear friend Jonathan, but as someone who had proven his loyalty amidst great challenges. The king often reminded his own sons of the importance of honoring commitments and treating everyone with justice, using Mephibosheth's example as a guide for ruling with heart and compassion. The relationship between David and Mephibosheth was a reflection of both men's ability to overcome the difficulties of the past and build something beautiful and meaningful in its place. They shared a friendship that, although born of an alliance between Jonathan and David, blossomed into a deep respect and affection. Mephibosheth, who had once feared death and obscurity, now lived surrounded by honor and love. David's sons also learned to love and respect Mephibosheth. He was treated as a beloved uncle, and his influence on them was palpable. Even the more ambitious sons, who sometimes succumbed to the temptations of power, found in Mephibosheth a voice of reason and balance. He taught them not with imposed authority, but with the authority earned through a life lived with integrity. As the years passed, Mephibosheth continued to live with gratitude for all he had received. He never forgot where he came from and never forgot the mercy that had been extended to him. Although he did not possess vast lands or military power, he had something far more valuable: the respect and love of all those around him, and the certainty that he had fulfilled his father Jonathan's legacy in a way that honored the memory of his family. In his final years, Mephibosheth lived in peace, surrounded by those who loved and admired him. His story was told and retold in Israel, a reminder that the value of a man is not in his physical strength or social position, but in his character, loyalty, and capacity to love and forgive. When Mephibosheth finally left this world, he was mourned not just as Saul's grandson or Jonathan's son, but as a man who, despite all adversity, lived a life of true nobility. And so, Mephibosheth's legacy remained, not in the material riches he could have inherited, but in the hearts and minds of those who learned, through his life, the true meaning of grace and redemption. If you enjoyed this incredible story of Mephibosheth and how it teaches us about loyalty, grace, and redemption, don't forget to leave a like on this video. It helps us continue bringing more inspiring stories and messages that touch the heart. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Together, we can continue exploring the powerful lessons the Bible has to offer. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.